Thanks, Isaac, for inviting me to this very, very welcoming occasion. So I'm just thinking, in accord to my talk this afternoon, what I want to do, I want to reflect to a monograph which I co-authored with a friend of mine who supervised my doctorate well over 20 years ago, William Baynard, who also has worked in this region, the Karoo, and parts of the Eastern Cape at length. So when we did this book, which Isaac has shown, it was published initially by the Vets Press in 2011. And in recent times, the Footprint Press has reissued it in 2021. As you already know, we have got limited copies that are in circulation. In fact, we're giving them for free, really. And we do hope you will support our publisher Footprint and buy more copies. That's the incentive to circulate those. But where I want to start, why a book on prickle pear? Which obviously at the time when it started was the first social history of a plant in South Africa in 2011 when we did it, at least in this part of the world. I know Samuel Mills have done some work on the vineyards. In fact, he published just a few months after we did. So we were able to beat him in doing this. But in my case particularly, why the interest? It started as part of my postdoctoral work 22 years or so ago. I had spent much of my doctoral research looking on families that were removed from parts of the Karoo into the mainland Ciskei and outlying areas. And in doing that kind of research, whenever I was driving on the lengths and breadths of the Eastern Cape, I was seeing these women selling prickle pear. You see, you can't fault in the summer months, especially from January right up to April, on almost all small towns around the Karoo. So that was an interest first. I started interviewing these groups, and it was intriguing how they knew more about this plant. And some had grown in several farms, and they knew how to utilize, and there were lots of local skills that have been carried from generation to generation, which was quite interesting. Obviously, I had an interest in Karoo. My father at one stage was an inspector posted, school inspector posted in Cradock many, many years ago in the 70s, and he covered the breadth of Cradock right up to Newport as he was speaking during that old kind of Cape education system. But he got barred, another story for another day. Obviously, then the prickle pear fruit sellers, they just draw my interest. And what was intriguing, you're looking at the economies of the Karoo, sometimes from the entry towns, really. Towns like Fort Beaufort, Grahamstown, now renamed Makoma and Makanda. Pardon, sometimes I'm using historical names. I know these towns have been renamed. And invariable, these individuals selling these fruits were just focusing on generating cash, but there were other practices that they were using the fruit for. I'm going to reflect to those later. But on the sales themselves, what was intriguing, fruit sellers, they either package the fruit in tin dishes, buckets, and in these plastic bags, all makeshift, sold very, very cheaply. And as I said, I started interviewing and got a grasp of knowledge on how they were utilizing. At that same time I was doing this, my co-publisher or my co-author, William, had written a book on the rise of conservation in South Africa, and it was looking particularly on the Karoo, sheep farming in this particular area, stretching up to Graaff-Reinet, dealing obviously, as I've said, with sheep farming. And as I read his work, eradication of prickle pear appeared to have been a major thing here happening in the 1930s. Obviously, at that stage, there were imperatives that were driving that major eradication. I presume everyone here is familiar with prickle pear. The cladode, which is like the leaf, is carrying this fruit, which has got glotches, those fine prickle pear, spiny kind of things. From the ripe fruit, they made a lot of damage on livestock. If the livestock eat that, it will be heavily infested and could even result to death. There was obviously extensive archive on this subject, and it's worth following up. And it was clear probing on this history of prickle pear revealed different perspectives on this introduced exotic plant, which the women, on the other hand, they were generating income, selling, and they had utilized for various processes. And then you have got this kind of scientific background, which was garnering at some stage for eradication. So these kinds of ambivalent worlds were quite an intrigue for us. So we started then getting involved into this debate of biodiversity through this particular plant. It was very interesting looking at the history of the Eastern Cape. And as I've reflected in my case, I started researching on resettlement force removals, and here now I was looking on the Eastern Cape via the vantage of a plant and looking on this rural area with a different kind of perspective. Just to give you a bit of a background, a very context about the prickle pear, which obviously is long, and I'm trying to truncate this. This is one of the many Americans or a Mexican plant that spread all over Southern Europe, particularly North Africa, and within a couple of centuries. And it's still established in places like Ethiopia and on the Horn of Eastern Africa, around Eritrea. It traveled routes of maritime empires and reached the Cape in the 18th century. And Graaff-Reinet, which is not far from here, around about late 1700s, where it was initially used as fodder, fruit, and for hedging. Of course, the plant was spread by people. That's very interesting. And other natural agencies were very instrumental in its spread. Was attractive to many species, from crows to baboons, daisies, and to quite I would say, domesticated livestock. The spiny type equally reproduced by seed. And rivers were important route in this kind of expansion. And prickle pear grew comfortably in rocky territories, but thrive even on better alluvial soil. Your typical Cape rivers and streams were often seasonal, as it's still the case even now, albeit affected by climate change. And they would come down in floods after heavy rainfall in their large and dry catchments, often tore these cladwoods, and once they get swept, they hook on the soil, and then it just got spread. And at one stage, actually conquered almost a third of the 170,000 square kilometer of the Eastern Cape, entire Karoo, right up to Saskatchewan territories. So by that early 19th century, when it covered that kind of a dense, high density, and everyone looking at it at that stage as an overwhelming kind of scourge, concerns were already there. And if you look at the districts that were hard hit, which obviously are your districts that are are very close to here. You know, the strip between Oldson to Grahamstown infested all, I mean, these current districts like Pierston, Somerset East, Craufurd, as I've mentioned, Middleburg, Gainsburg. There is a very interesting observation by a Quaker who was traveling around about mid-19th century, who was speaking about cradle particularly, and noted that this orange flowered cactus is naturalized here. So it had just clamped on this particular part. So through transhumance and natural factors, it also extended eastward, as I mentioned, into the interior of the sky. Major thickets around the Kaiskama, parts of Pedi, and northern areas of Utilise and Thaka. So what happens then? At the beginning of the 20th century, so this invasive spiny prickle pear and its spread had reached this massive, uncontrollable proportion around about 1930s and 40s, prompting this major biological campaign to eradicate or reduce thickets with the use of some chemicals, cactoblastis and cochineal. And that campaign was partially successful, especially in the Karoo and drier areas. And in fact, in our book, we have matched photos before and after eradication, where you can just see the thickets heavily infested and those that had been wiped off after eradication, which obviously ended around about 1950s, especially in the Craufurd area. Yet, despite that eradication campaign, there was still ambivalence, even from the scientists, since there was a realization of the multi-purpose use of this plant. And I'm just going to focus a little bit on that particular aspect as I am moving forward. So we have now in recent time realized that this is a plant that continues being not only used for fruit selling, but also, as we've indicated, serve on multi-fronts for household remedies. The cladode itself can be used in forms which we describe in the book, blood purification, laxatives, which actually counters even what is the constipation you get from the fruit itself, which is fascinating. So it throws other dimensions. And obviously there are other processes of other products which have unfortunately declined in this age of commodification. One of the uses which we describe quite at large is the brewing. Now I just want to spend a little bit of time on this because everyone thinks this is just a very, very recent kind of exercise. Actually, it's got more than 150 years of existence. It's a closer terminology people use, piliga, which actually comes from a Hoi kiri kind of, you can even resonate with the click itself. And it's, as I've indicated, is an exercise that's been there for well over 150 years. And in our book, we use the terminologies, we trace the practice, and we use the language. The process was, and it's still similar to honey beer, and it reveals this dynamic indigenous and local language. In a crude definition of this practice, the peeled prickle pear fruit is mixed with a yeast plant. There is also a closer name people use, mula, which is actually the root of a mesobrandhium plant. And it's a fermenting agency, which when this mix is put together, within 48 hours there's heavy fermentation. You still have got to filter. depending how long you can leave this, obviously it could be a very, very strong, potent drink, but I'm still going to come to a very potent one. I've got 3 minutes. I'm going to skip while I'm on my notes, while I'm still on this. The one aspect we've realized, obviously the fruit cuts across racial, sort of all social groups. Nostalgic sort of events, especially in places like Yudnik, now renamed Kariga. Africans used to have major festival there, and lots of products that used to be showcased on this particular fruit in form of syrup, chutneys, and all of these being processed directly from the fruit. But the most popular one there also was a very, very potent drink called Vetplets. Or Vetplets, which is the white lightning. In fact, if you go there, you'll still see a post or a poster written in Afrikaans, Salige op de tong, which probably means heavily on the tongue. And this is spirit rather than beer. So you're not talking honey beer, you're talking spirit. And can go up to an alcohol volume of 63%. Massive. And you've got to have special license. You'd need, I think, I'm trying to remember the museum there, which is not Droski, the other one, Maina, right outside, was the one that had special license for the brewing. And unfortunately, this event is no longer done. But in conclusion then, where are we going with this book? With the debate, obviously, prickle pear is actually declared weed in South Africa. It's seen as weed by especially the Department of Agriculture and even within the Department of Land Reform. In spite of these poor people, especially poor women, generating a lot of income from it. Now, what we are arguing if these departments, especially Thoko Didiza, if they can have a master plan for other sort of plants like dagga, why don't have a master plan for prickle pear, especially since it's already been used by these women to generate income, and here we're proving figures that they can supplement even more with their monthly annual pension incomes using the plant in a very lawful way. Obviously, brewing needs to be controlled. We know there were evidences of brewing even during the lockdown, during COVID, that were happening below the radar. But we never had cases that are fatal regarding prickle pear. There were fatal other cases we're hearing. So this is a significant plant in a number of ways. And we are trying to say the government has got to have an open mind. Here are people utilizing just aspects of environment, an exotic plant that has become naturalized in South Africa. Thank you very much.
I just have to say, I thought I'd heard it all. I've never heard a talk like that. I mean, it's the most unique talk that I've heard in years.